Hi, everyone. Nice to be presenting here today. Compared to the more conceptual note we just saw, I think this is a little more of an update rather than and looking at the work we've been doing right now in Sri Lanka as a Sri Lankan team. And I'd also like to invite Tilni and Menya, who are on call right now, to jump in at any time if they'd like to maybe be a bit more descriptive on the slides. So let's jump right in. So the way in which I've structured this presentation is I'm going to just introduce you very briefly to some members of our team, some who you've already seen, including myself. Then I'd like to give you a bit of a contextual dive into essentially what gender inequality looks like in Sri Lanka, as well as the care economy in Sri Lanka. And the idea behind why we want to look at essentially gender inequality first and then the care economy is because the two things, especially, so when I say gender inequality, what I'm actually looking into here is particularly in relation to the labor force in Sri Lanka. And the reason we want to look at those two things hand in hand is because there's strong cultural implications and interactions between these two components. Secondly, so right after that, I'd like to give you, as I said, it's more of an update. So I'll be taking you all through our research plan, as well as the progress we've made so far, including some highlights within the research methodologies, and implementations of those methodologies for Team Sri Lanka. Great. So let me just get into it. Meeting the team, right? So you've definitely already seen Dilani Banwardana. You've seen Owenia De Silva, so we have a team leader, an anthropologist. That's me, Ashvin. So I'm a data analyst, and you will see in the slide deck as well, I use a lot of numbers in how I communicate. That's more my forte. And then we have Hasna as well, who sadly isn't here with us today, but she's been very instrumental so far in the work that we've done. So let me give you our country context. So I wanted to first look at how the labor market is formed in Sri Lanka, particularly in relation to women and work. So you'd see a good 50%, so half of our population tend to be women, out of which when you actually then move from there to the labor force, it's far less. So 30% of our labor force are actually women participants. When we look at employed women, so only 34% of employed persons are women. And I think it's particularly important, given that Sri Lanka is a post-colonial state, to look at what we term to be the estate sector as well. So you see within the estate sector of employed persons, women tend to have a higher participation. And the reason why these terms are, essentially, I've also outlined there what the estate sector actually is. So it's a sector that is predominantly recorded in terms of the plantation sectors that exist in Sri Lanka. And these are the things that we want to be focusing on in the work that we do in relation to the care economy, particularly in relation to this post-colonial context, where we not only have urban and rural sectors in our country, but also the estate sector as well. And then just around on private and public participation. So in the private sector, and the public sector, so we have more private sector participation of women in the workforce as opposed to the public sector. So moving from employment into the informal sector, which is, I think, a little more important to us. We have 40% of the formal sector, we have female employment, and then 30%, so less so in the informal sector, are women. So this is the next couple of statistics are then concentrated towards the informal sector. So within the informal sector, 22% of employees there are women, and 13%. Women form around 22% of employees within the informal sector, and less so 13% of employers within the informal sector. So more so towards the employees sector. 27% of own account workers tend to be women, and so 80% of unpaid family workers are women. So it's quite a high number, considering all the low participation rates in the rest of the stats that we've seen so far. So moving into unemployment and inactivity, looking at unemployment rates, you see that the unemployment rate tends to be higher for female, for women as opposed to men, and that so 56% of unemployed persons are women, and also along. Sorry.
The slides aren't moving in Zoom.
Yeah.
So
maybe it's.
Yeah, it says that your screen sharing. Maybe if we go out and come back in.
Yeah.
Is it? Yeah.
It's okay. I'm just going to continue from that, I think, if that's okay with you. Yeah. Great. Yeah. So more so important than unemployment, I think, in Sri Lanka is sort of the inactive workforce, and that is also where sort of employment on the labor market then feeds into the care sector. 70% of the inactive workforce in Sri Lanka is comprised of women, and 50% of inactive women are household workers. And there's a lot of cultural sort of tying in as to why then women tend to be part of the inactive workforce of household workers within Sri Lanka. Okay. So yeah, then moving sort of from that employment sort of perspective into the gender wage gap, we see that 22% of the overall, so the wage gap is essentially at 22%, where essentially when you look at the relative wage of women to men, 78% of the overall, so women earn 78% of the overall relative earnings of men. Right? And you see a clear separation within the formal to the informal sector. It's as much as 87% in the formal sector. So women do better in the formal sector in comparison to the informal sector, but still, so there is a relatively large wage gap, and these are all things that end up being sort of influenced by sort of the culture within Sri Lanka, which is something that I'd like to then sort of break apart right now. And so the slides that I'm going to show you right now are based on a part of the research that we're doing right now in relation to the care economies in context. And that is essentially this comprehensive desk study that we're trying to get done, which is trying to put together the research and the literature that exists in relation to Sri Lanka, as well as working with a lot of the data sets that we have access to at the moment. So data sets that are put together by the Department of Census and Statistics, which is the main government census body in Sri Lanka, and along with as comprehensive of a look as we can as to the cultural context, particularly in Sri Lanka. And so just to give you an overview of how these different sort of cultural backgrounds feed into the care economy. So you'll see, so these are different takes based on different pieces of literature that we've put together right now. This is by no means as comprehensive as the desk study that we have right now. What I've done is I've put together certain things that highlight the research that we're doing. So you see that sort of a lot of household chores, cooking, childcare, and general housework are routinely relegated to women. The thing about Sri Lanka is in terms of our national identity and nationhood, women essentially are portrayed to a large extent as caregivers to the nation. And it's something that you see heavily inbuilt into the way we view our national identity and women in respect to that national identity. Not only this, but Sri Lanka is a country that also has been through quite a bit from colonialism and the effects of colonialism, as well as essentially our sort of struggle for national identity from a country that has gone through a 30-year civil war. And so as a result, when looking at how the idea and the notion of gender norms and women in Sri Lanka with respect to those changes in Sri Lanka through its history, we also see that compared to a post-war nation, this is in respect to the civil war, we've seen that a lot of pre-war gender norms that sort of relegate women towards being respectable wives and mothers, that sort of notion has been built up further after this 30-year war. Again, these are all pieces of research that we've taken in terms of literature that exists in relation to Sri Lanka right now. We also see that the dominance of, and this is sort of where I make this bridge between sort of the care economy, between the labor market and the care economy, right, is sort of, you see as a result of all this, as a result of this culture, as a result of sort of how we see women and gender norms in a national identity. What you end up seeing is there's a lot of research that looks at how that then limits women's sort of involvement in productive economic labor. It limits career development and advancements and leadership potential. And these are things that you see quite frequently in many studies that are done in Sri Lanka that sort of look at women's participation in the labor force. So let's look at it again from a numbers specific perspective. You see, when we particularly look at participation rates of men and women in the care economy, this is a combination of domestic and care work. You see that women tend to have a larger participation, so 87% in comparison to men. In terms of then deconstructing that participation, particularly, so this is in relation to housework participation across the board. So these are key areas of housework participation that the Department of Census and Statistics in Sri Lanka has sort of put together. We see that women also tend to participate a lot more in housework related activities. When going into care activity participation is low across the board between men and women, according to the national statistics. But even so, women participate a lot more than men do in care work as well. So looking at participation, moving away from participation into time spent, so we look at mean after time. And we see that women on average spend more than almost 2 times more time on care services than men do. So those were the general national statistics that we took from the Department of Census and Statistics. What I'd like to show you right now is something that I'm going to highlight a bit later when we look at the current research plan and activities that we have already gone through in Sri Lanka. And these are taken from research that, these are taken from certain things, activities that we have already participated in and done in terms of developing the research for the Sri Lankan team. And this is taken from the desk study that we've been sort of putting together right now, which is currently in a draft stage. These are some interesting things I'd like to highlight from that study. So we've been looking at trends in care participation for men and women in the labor force, trying to compare between the two. And so what you see is that, interestingly enough, women aged 20 and above across the board, most of those women tend to participate in the in household and in household work. What we see for men is that the participation of men tends to be more gradual, and that men take up higher participation as they reach sort of marital status. And this I will highlight again when we look at participation in relation to marriage. In relation to the care economy context, we see that care work tends to be, again, women tend to reach a higher participation when they reach an age where, which is usually likened to the childbearing age for women in Sri Lanka. And so you see within 32, 39 years, you have your highest participation for women, as opposed to, and this is similar so to men, but again, less so in terms of participation. And this is what I was talking about in terms of marital status as well. So when men and women are married in Sri Lanka, they are more likely to they are more likely to participate in both housework and care. Something that's interesting that we found was the sort of the gendered nature of household domestic work. And so you see that particularly when it comes to household cleaning and food preparation and things like that. You see higher female participation. And when it comes to things like household maintenance and management, you tend to have higher male participation. But again, it's still important to note that even when there is male sort of dominant participation in the Sri Lankan household, female participation is still comparable across those sort of care activities. When looking at mean active time, so this is time spent by participants per day by sex and marital status. You tend to see that when women are married, the time that they spend tends to double across both care work and unpaid domestic services, as opposed to men, where the times tend to sort of increase, but not by not that much. Yeah, and so that's essentially a rundown of what the Sri Lankan context looks like. And so what I'd like to show you now is essentially our research plan and essentially where we are at right now. So in terms of our proposed plan, there are 4 key areas that we want to look at. So the first thing, which is again something that you just saw evidence of, is this status review that we're trying to do. We are trying to look at all the current evidence, both literature-based and data-based, in terms of trying to understand the care economy as it exists right now in Sri Lanka. And so to that end, we have been putting together a desk study. We are also in the process of undertaking so we also want to undertake a field survey. So we want to map out the entire care economy, including childcare and elder care in Sri Lanka. And we want to do that in terms of a field survey and a qualitative process as well, which will be highlighted further by my colleague Venya. So along with, so we want to review the status of the care economy, we want to collect data, and using that, we want to measure and estimate the size of and value of unpaid and paid care in Sri Lanka. And that's something that we have already done a lot of work in. So my colleague Delaney and I have currently worked on presenting a paper that values, that is essentially a first estimate at valuing unpaid care work in Sri Lanka. So after we have done our measurements, what we want to do along with that is we want to start developing policy tools, essentially policy tools that can be used by policymakers like the Central Bank and the Ministry of National Planning, which is a part of our Ministry of Finance, in order to better target policy that considers the care work and the care sector in Sri Lanka. So what does this progress look like? In terms of progress made, general progress made, funding is something that we have particularly been looking for. And so something that's new that has come up is that we have started conversations with Co-Impact in procuring funding for our research. That is particularly a new update compared to, I think, things that we've discussed with the teams before. We've also been in touch with our Department of Census and Statistics in putting together a comprehensive sort of collection of data related to Sri Lanka, particularly the household income and expenditure surveys, the time use surveys, our demographics and health survey, and the labor force surveys up to the latest possible date. We also last year underwent a Levi intensive macroeconomic training course in order to better prepare for this project. And we have begun devising an activity plan to analyze the existing data. So that brings me essentially to the latter part, which is the highlights of the research that we've done so far. And so the first highlight that I have for you is essentially this paper that we have put together, which is essentially valuing unpaid care work in Sri Lanka using the National Time Use Survey 2017. It's a set of first estimates that was written by Delaney Gunawardana, our team leader, and me, Ashvin Perera. And essentially getting into survival. I'd like to take you through essentially very briefly the methodology for it. So we followed a lot from SUA 2020, particularly choosing an input measurement method relating to the replacement cost. We looked at different wages in relation to that methodology. So looking at trying to estimate what a generalist wage in Sri Lanka would look like, as well as a specialist wage in Sri Lanka. And I've just highlighted there what that calculation tends to look like, where we try to aggregate to a population level the time spent on care activities times the substituted wage rate in order to get at that calculation. So in terms of how we did the mapping in Sri Lanka, so the way Sri Lankan data tends to be organized is labor data tends to be classified under the ISCO 8 guidelines. And so in order to actually start mapping labor activities to wages, what we ended up doing was we decided to consider the median pooled employee wage. And so the reason we sort of settled on this idea was firstly looking at the data that we had available, and also looking at various sort of papers that we had already looked into that had already applied these kinds of calculations. We went with a median wage because we thought that a median wage would tend to be more skewed. And when looking at the Sri Lankan data tends to pull to be heavily skewed on the lower end. And so in order to account for that skew in the wage data, we decided to sort of concentrate on a median wage, and we looked at pooled employee wages, right? And so using this, we put together a set of wages that we could use to assess and calculate our care economy estimates. So we then set about creating a lower bound wage and an upper bound wage, again taking heavily from sort of Sue's initial estimates from the papers that we borrowed from. And so we ended up going and mapping our labor force wage data to our care economies, our time use data. And so this is what that mapping ended up looking like. So where we matched the IC8 US codes and the care activities to the labor force codes. And following through, we ended up with our first estimates of unpaid care work in Sri Lanka, which on the lower bound using our minimum wage valuation, we had 10.3% of GDP. So unpaid care work, we estimate to range between 10.3% of GDP to 40% of GDP. And when we look at that in particular in relation to women, we see that it potentially ranges between 8.6% in the lowest case and 35% of GDP in the highest case. Some things that we didn't necessarily consider or decided to leave behind for now when we initially did this evaluation were in considering, so our time use survey data also collects and differentiates time use in between main activities and secondary activities. And so when we did our analysis, we decided to concentrate primarily on main activities, but some extensions that we could possibly do to this is then taking into account. So situations where a mother may be watching over their child while they engage in some other form of main time use. The second highlight is this care work desk study that we've been doing, and you've seen evidence of sort of what we've been collecting. It is by no means, I wouldn't say it's a good representation of what this desk study entails, because we predominantly also go into the breakdown of the care economy in Sri Lanka based on existing literature, not into more detail, particularly looking at, for example, the urban, rural, and estate sectors in themselves, and how those sectors are differentiated by the cultures and the sort of the internal sort of dynamics within those areas. But essentially, this is a first draft that we are currently mapping out, in the process of mapping out. As a third sort of highlight, we have this qualitative data collection system. And I would like to invite my colleague Venya to sort of describe exactly what this process is. And I think Dilani will follow after as well, and sort of end this presentation. So let me just hand it over.
Okay, thanks, Ashvin. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry not to be there in person. I had very much hoped to be there at the conference, but had some issues getting a visa. I'm currently in France, but very, very pleased to be able to join via Zoom. So I'm just going to very briefly talk about the qualitative approach that we're hoping to use as part of the study. I should say that it's a very provisional approach, which will be refined based on the kind of funding that comes through for our project. So we're hoping to use 6 steps or 6 components of qualitative data. Some of this data will be gathered before the quantitative data comes in. Some of it will be gathered as part of the quantitative data collection process, and some of it will be gathered sort of alongside or after. So in terms of the 6 steps, we're thinking of first starting with some key informant interviews with a mix of public officials and policy experts working in the fields of care, as well as with market providers of care. And the objective here is to sort of understand what one might call expert opinions on the state infrastructure and policy landscape, and to locate existing structural provisions and gaps in the Sri Lankan context. In terms of step 2, we're thinking of undertaking a series of focus group discussions. And we're thinking of potentially 4 focus group discussions in 4 different parts of Sri Lanka, with approximately 6 to 8 participants per discussion. And we're hoping that these focus group discussions will offer a community-based approach to understanding the similarities and differences in the provision of care within families and in the community. So in other words, sort of insight into the inter and intra-community values and norms relating to care. As a third step, we're thinking of including a few open-ended questions which are relevant to understanding the care economy at the household level as an annex or an appendix to a larger national level quantitative survey. And we're thinking that this would be useful to start to sort of clarify some of the emerging puzzles and gaps based on the sort of key informant interviews that we would have done and the focus group discussions. Next, we're thinking of in-depth interviews, and this will form the core of our qualitative data collection. And we're thinking of maybe 75 interviews across the country. Again, all of this will be refined as research progresses. And we're hoping that these sort of in-depth interviews will help us to map the contours of the care economy through the identification and exploration of key themes in the narratives of people working in the care economy, both in the formal sector and the informal sector. So specifically, we're hoping to explore how the intersection of identity categories, gender, age, ethnicity, education level, marital status, urban, rural living, all of that contributes to and compounds and sustains inequalities in the care economy. We're also hoping to elicit views on what types of interventions might be perceived as being the most relevant or as having an immediate and long-term impact. As a fifth sort of component of qualitative data, we're thinking about life histories with approximately 10 people. And we're hoping to select the candidates for these life histories based on the interviews that we would have conducted in step 4. And the objective here will be to understand the lived experience of those working in the care economy. So specifically, we're hoping to explore the interplay of structure and agency. So structure as defined by state institutions and policies, market provisions of care, gender norms, etc. And agency understood as how people interpret and interact with these institutions and entities and roles, responsibilities. We're also hoping to use these life histories to highlight the kinds of value that are relevant in the care economy, such as trust and responsibility and reciprocity and vulnerability. And also to understand how experience in agency and outlook changes over a person's life course. So we're hoping to use this kind of data to produce a series of portraits that illustrate the landscape of care in Sri Lanka and to understand some of the alternative parameters of the care economy. And finally, in terms of qualitative data, we are also hoping to prepare a few case studies. And the data for these case studies will be obtained through site visits. And our hope here is to be able to contribute learnings from Sri Lanka to sort of global conversations about what works and why in a variety of different settings. If we could move to the next slide, maybe. Thanks. So next, I'm also hoping to, talk through some of our thinking about intersectionality and how sort of we're hoping qualitative methods might help us to think through intersectionality in our project, and also as a way of putting some of this thinking into practice. So first, in terms of how we're defining intersectionality, we are using this term to communicate a sort of commitment to understanding the social structures and categories that intersect and overlap to shape disadvantage and discrimination, subordination, and exclusion, as well as opportunity and choice in the context of the care economy. We feel that intersectionality is important for understanding how inequality and marginalization is sustained, and equally that it's important for understanding how and where resilience is located, for enabling voice and creating space, and for ensuring that policies do not adversely impact groups that are already multiply disadvantaged. Which brings me to sort of my next point about, the challenges associated with using an intersectional approach. In the context of our research, we have identified 3 key challenges. First, we recognize that the outcome of intersectionality is an experience that is greater than the sum of its parts. So our data can tell us about what contributes to disadvantage or discrimination, but it may be less good at telling us about the experience itself or the implications of this experience. And second, we acknowledge that sometimes neither the researcher nor the research participant is able to identify which elements of an identity contribute to discrimination or disadvantage or opportunity, especially in the context of prevailing social norms in Sri Lanka, where gender roles and care responsibilities are so closely intertwined. And third, we are faced with this question of exploring the complexity that is associated with intersectionality without overcomplicating the issue to the extent that comparisons and useful generalizations cannot be made. So having said all that, this sort of brings me to a third point about how we are thinking about developing an intersectional approach. And we're hoping that our methodology will try to accommodate how intersectionality is defined and used in the context of our project, and wherever possible to try to address some of the challenges that are posed when we use intersectionality as an analytical category. So of course, the first step is the collection of disaggregated data. And second, we feel that there is an important role here for qualitative data collection as well, to sit alongside sort of quantitative data and quantitative models. Which brings me really to my fourth and final point about, the opportunities and limitations about that are posed by using qualitative data in a project such as this. So we understand that qualitative data risks potentially having only an illustrative status compared to quantitative data inputs, and that there will be limitations in drawing conclusions between the individual and the wider population. However, we also believe the qualitative data offers us a way forward in terms of unpacking the enabling and disabling aspects of identities, as a way of treating identities as multidimensional and relational, and a means of taking into account our own position as researchers and how this always and unavoidably shapes the research process. I think I will stop there so that maybe Delaney can discuss the next slide. Thanks.
Sure, thank you. And I apologize that you can barely see my face. My power cut kicked in. We have power cut for 1 hour and 20 minutes in Sri Lanka. And unfortunately, mine is at this moment in time. Can you hear me? Okay. So I will, I've actually drawn these descriptions from the harmonized surveys that were shared earlier, but I'll try to talk to how we plan to use them in Sri Lanka, and also questions that we have. Okay. Okay. So focusing on how the household family configuration. So as you know, some of the discussion has been has thrown up. In Sri Lanka, we are likely to have many different types of household family configurations, rising from different sort of cultural, you know, we might have certain cultural ethnic groups that tend to live in multiple households together. There may be other, you know, quite commonly, there will be multi-generational households where elderly parents live with their married children or their unmarried children. And also we may have, especially in urban areas, we may have families that have become, you know, nuclear families. They've migrated from their rural area to and they still have parents back in the rural area. So different configurations, different care arrangements and conditions. So especially labor force participation, as was pointed out to us, we would have, you know, people who engage in paid work outside the care economy, as well as unpaid work in the household. We might have people who only engage in unpaid work inside the household. And then we also have, you know, within a given household, we might have paid workers that live inside that household. You know, household configurations can be quite complex. And so a challenge to us will be how to incorporate this in the quantitative survey, what kind of sampling methods we use to capture this. Do we, how to balance this between capturing it in the qualitative process and in the quantitative survey. Then there's decision making, there's time and the form of care, the conditions of all the care recipients. In addition to the harmonized survey questions, we'd like to understand the link between labor supply choice and caregiving obligations. And I do realize this is playing a little bit into the sort of, you know, what we were talking about earlier about the sort of capitalist as opposed to the feminist motivation for thinking about the care economy. But at the same time, I think we also want to expand choices, expand the space of capabilities, if you like. And so, you know, taking away the cultural norms that are focused on, you know, the male breadwinner model and the ideas Ashvin was talking about earlier, that the woman is the natural caregiver. We think addressing that is important. And so, yeah. So barriers to the substitution of family care with social and market care. So this would be norms and so on, and these might play differently in different groups. Then when we talk about the childcare survey, who looks after children, for how long, pecuniary and other costs of childcare, the demand for paid childcare, and the use of paid childcare. So this is something that we may need to think a little bit more, and again, depending on funding, whether we have a separate survey that captures paid childcare, or whether we try to capture this through, focus group discussions and so on, rather than through the survey, because currently the survey focuses a lot on unpaid childcare, and it focuses a lot on the demand for childcare, but we are also interested in questions relating to the supply of childcare, particularly, well, I think both in terms of the supply of childcare and the supply of elder care. So that's something that I think we need to think through a little bit more and discuss a little bit more. And as with elder care, we'd like to elicit, concerns that people have, especially with, trusting their children to strangers and so on. The whole concept of childcare, paid childcare, or I have been saying paid childcare, but we are also thinking of, state-provided childcare that might be subsidized or that might be completely socially provided. So also in terms of, who gets the care, we are really concerned that we don't restrict ourselves to sort of middle income families. We are looking at all spectrums of the distribution. Thank you. So going on to the next steps, securing funding for the harmonized surveys and the qualitative research is next step. And then once we have that, beginning the qualitative data collection process. At the same time, we have sort of begun, and Ashvin and Martin can probably say a little bit about that, maybe not now, but later, on the CG model capacity building that we began. And then, though we have analyzed unpaid care work using the national service, we haven't analyzed paid care work yet. So that would be our next steps. So let me stop there.